is Angela at beginninggenealogist.com. How's everybody doing today? In the last video, I decided to take a close look at the federal census starting with 1930, going back to 1900. But before I go back farther in time and start to address the differences in the 19th century census records, it's really important that I review a few things that I pointed out, particularly from last week's video. I talked particularly about how you can find additional information in the 1910 census as well as in other census years about ancestors who may have served in the military. Well, several of you have written to me and had really some questions about looking at those ancestors who were listed in the 1910 census as having been survivors of the Civil War. Well, there are some clues that are there, obviously, for you to find out information about your family, but it can be a little bit confusing because several of you have started to look at the communities and you begin to notice some numbers that were written in that really were not clear what they were about. And I'm going to talk about those as we examine the documents more carefully. Also, 1910 and 1900 were two special years, especially for those who lived in U.S. territories and in those states where there were Native Americans living in large numbers. It's very possible that many individuals whom you seek might have been enumerated on the special Indian census that were particularly collected in 1910 and 1900. So join me as I go off camera and let's pull up some of those documents and examine them a little bit more closely. In a previous video, I mentioned the wonderful information that can be obtained about ancestors who were survivors of the Civil War. In the column, third from the right, there is a category for that. A viewer sent me a question because she noticed that there were numbers that are sometimes written in those boxes that did not seem logical. It has been explained by officials at the National Archives that these markings are not numbers that are answers to questions posed in those particular columns. In many cases, these were statistical summaries that workers in the Census Bureau had written, not the census enumerators. In other words, these were markings made by census tabulators, those who were compiling the data. These are the markings that they later made and were not made by the census enumerator. You, as the genealogical researcher, will have to make the effort to decipher the original marking that may have appeared underneath the marking that was made by workers in the Census Bureau. In some cases, they were written over the original number. An extra word about 1910 and 1900. In those two census years, there was an effort to begin to count officially the American Indian population in the federal census. Those who were living in known U.S. territories and states, particularly where there were sizable Native American populations, they were often enumerated on the special Indian census. You are probably familiar with what the regular 1910 census schedule looks like. This is the 1910 Indian census. Those who were living on reservations or those who were living in known and established Indian communities, tribal towns, or villages were enumerated on this census, and this census was used in multiple states. Such enumerations appear in New England states, particularly Connecticut and Massachusetts, but in other states where Indians were residing as well: New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Virginia, the Carolinas, Florida, Mississippi, Louisiana, and many additional states to the west. Instead of data pertaining to 50 people on a page, the data collected reflected 20. The page is divided in half with data on the bottom reflecting additional information pertaining to those whose names were listed on the top half. The data on the top is exactly the same data collected from the general population, but the bottom half of the Special Indian Census contains additional questions unique to many Indian populations, and they are worth examining more closely. Using both regular census forms as well as blank census forms that one can obtain from sites such as Ancestry or from other free sites, one can take a look at the various categories. Information regarding the individuals is collected and their tribal affiliation. And it should be noted that the tribe of both parents is also collected. Information was also asked about the proportion of Indian blood, and very clearly in the 1910 Special Census, it asked the person if they had what percentage of Indian, white, or Negro blood. In some communities where polygamy may have been practiced, it was asked how many times the individual was married, if they were currently in a polygamous relationship, and if in any cases the wives may have been sisters. The educational institution from which an individual had graduated was also asked. This was not asked in the general population census. By rotating the form, one can see other questions that were also asked as well, particularly pertaining to individuals and their tax status. Also, a particularly interesting question does appear: whether or not an individual had received their own land and were living on land allotments. And probably one of the most unusual questions was whether or not the individual lived in a fixed dwelling or an aboriginal dwelling. In 1900, there was a similar census schedule with some differences. If the person had a name other than what was listed above, it was written down on the bottom half of that form. Tribal affiliation, of course, was also asked. The mixtures of blood were not as detailed as they were in 1910. The data collected was simply noted whether or not the Indian had any mixture of white blood. Marital status was addressed, as was the question, again, of polygamy. Okay, I hope that's been very helpful. It is important to understand, once again, that sometimes you're looking at inscriptions that were made not by the census taker, but sometimes by the census tabulator. And of course, it is important to know where to find those special Indian census records to be able to capture additional data about the community and about those who lived in Native American towns, tribal towns, or villages. Anyway, I hope this has been useful for you, and take care, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.